Akumajō Dracula, otherwise known as Super Castlevania IV, was released for the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom in 1991. And fans of the Castlevania series will note that the Japanese releases usually differ from the North American and European releases of the series. They're usually censored for content like blood, gore, violence, and nudity, as well as religious imagery. So let's pop this game in the old modified Super Nintendo and see how it looks. And incidentally, if you'd like to play this game, you need to play it on either a Japanese Super Famicom or a modified North American Super Nintendo. It won't play in a normal North American Super Nintendo. And right from the beginning, we can see that there is something that the North American and European versions did not have, and that's blood in the opening sequence. I know it sounds kind of pathetic that they would have thought to edit this out for decency purposes, but times were different in the early 90s, and Nintendo was very gun-shy about what content they released outside of Japan. And although the whole concept of Nintendo censoring their content for something as minor as blood and violence seems quite strange, you gotta think back at the time that this was happening. And prior to 1985, when Nintendo broke onto the scene in North America, the video game industry was all but dead. So Nintendo is more or less solely responsible for reviving the entire industry. So you might say they were a little overly cautious at protecting the industry that they helped revive. You see, there was this perception of the United States outside of the United States that they were overly sensitive to religious issues and things like violence, gore, and nudity. And to an extent, that's somewhat true. But I think Nintendo went a little overboard with their censorship. And as far as the European censorship is concerned, that has mostly to do with Germany's strict guidelines on that sort of stuff. So instead of having a separate German-only release, they decided to make the content appropriate for the German market and just release it to all of Europe. Now, Akumajō Dracula, or Super Castlevania IV, or whatever you want to call it, is a fantastic game. It really shows off the capabilities that the Super Nintendo can do, and the gameplay itself is challenging yet appropriate. It seldom comes off as gimmicky, even though that could very well be the case whenever a new system is released with new features and new controls. Now, if you're familiar with Castlevania for the Nintendo Entertainment System, you'll notice a lot of familiar elements carried over with Super Castlevania IV. The general game concept and gameplay is largely identical. There are some new features in this game as far as gameplay is concerned, but it doesn't deviate too much from the original concept of the original Castlevania. That original concept being that it's primarily a platformer game, with elements of a hack and slash. Now, one thing I'd like to mention in gameplay is that a nice thing to see that you don't see all that often when a new system comes out is that even though the Super Nintendo had 6 buttons in addition to the D-pad, and most developers felt the need to use all 6 buttons, even if it wasn't really necessary. In Super Castlevania IV, aside from the D-pad, only 3 buttons are used. And they are well thought out in the design. The default setup is the Y and B buttons control your jumping and your whip, and the right bumper button controls your secondary weapon. And you can change these options in the options menu, but I really don't find it necessary. I mean, it's pretty much the perfect setup. Now, there are 11 stages in total, and a lot of them take place actually outside of the actual castle. But there are 11 stages, and each stage ends in a boss. And once you defeat the boss, you get one of those crystal balls, and that progresses you to the next stage. I remember the first time I played this game, and when I first saw this stage map in between stages, I was floored at the extent and the scope of this game. I just remember thinking, holy fuck, I got a lot ahead of me if I want to actually beat this game. Now I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about the music in the game, and it's simply spectacular. It absolutely helps create the perfect mood for the game. It's often cited as one of the better examples of music in video games. And I tend to agree with that analysis. When I think back about video game music that made an impression on me, the Castlevania series, and this game in particular, are good examples. Now, although there have been many improvements on the series with this game, the one thing they did not get rid of is the mechanic where when you get hit by an enemy, you fly backwards. And that can prove pretty frustrating and challenging in most of the Castlevania series. But other improvements were made in the controls in that you can somewhat control your jumping with the D-pad, and you no longer have to enter the stairs from the very top or bottom. You can jump and land midway on the stairs and continue up or down the steps, which is a vast improvement from the original Castlevania. Here I'm fighting one of the end bosses, and it seems to be Medusa. And if you'll notice, Medusa is not wearing a shirt, which was probably edited for the North American and European release. Now I say probably because I don't know for sure. I don't actually have a copy of the North American version, Super Castlevania IV. So if somebody out there does have a copy of the North American version and knows the answer to this question for sure, whether Medusa does in fact have her bare breasts covered in that version or not, please let me know in the comments section. So all in all, Akumajō Dracula, or Super Castlevania IV, depending on which version you have, is a fantastic game. Now if you're gaming outside of Japan and you're wondering whether the Japanese version is worth it to pick up, that's up to you. It depends on how big of a fan of the series you are. I personally am a pretty big fan, and I find the regional variations quite interesting. But regardless of which version you have or prefer, this game is simply a masterpiece. One of the best games out there for the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. It provides plenty of challenge and great gameplay. Coupled with wonderful controls and great music, you can't go wrong. And if you've never played this game before, it's a must-have for the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. That should go without say. And even if you don't have a Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, this game is available on the Wii Virtual Console if you do have a Nintendo Wii. And there you have it. Akumajō Dracula or Super Castlevania IV. One of the better games out there for the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. I'm Dommie from Classic Games Revisited. Until next time.